calls for stricter restrictions and some Albertans not following the rules, Premier Jason Kenney was forced to put politics aside.
Governments must not impair people's rights or their livelihoods unless it is absolutely necessary to save lives and, in this case, to prevent disaster from unfolding in our hospitals. Unfortunately, that is the situation that we are facing today.
Sending a message to Albertans and those in his own party about a need for compliance.
We will not tolerate people counseling fellow Albertans to violate the law, to engage in civil disobedience, or doing it themselves.
This as the province continues to report the most COVID cases per capita, prompting an emergency debate in the House of Commons and an offer of federal assistance.
Like it might be a problem.
So what does this mean for the state of Jason Kenney's leadership? It's Thursday. I'm here with that issue. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. Good to see all of you. I'll start with you, Chantal. Jason Kenney talked a lot about the need for compliance, but how much blame does he actually hold for the lack of compliance in the situation that Alberta finds itself in right now?
It's hard to apportion blame to any premier, but in this case, it is clear that Albertans expected more and have been expecting more from the government and more leadership on this for a long time. There is a reason why Jason Kenney went from one of the most popular premiers when the pandemic started to back last fall, probably the premier whose province was the least satisfied with his efforts. So he has been tone deaf to the sense of his medical establishment, health authorities, but also voters, that they wanted more restrictions more quickly. The problem now is that a year in, it's harder to get people to comply than it would have been way back in November or this time last year.
Well, and is it harder to get people to comply, Andrew, because of his messaging, but also from the members of his own caucus?
Yes, first of all, Alberta generally was in a pretty nasty mood going into the pandemic because of all they've gone through in their economy, and also because of a feeling that they were under siege in terms of their major export, et cetera. Add to that a long-standing kind of libertarian tradition in that province that has been increasingly fed in recent years by a kind of a Trumpian populist anti-expert type of sentiment. And that, yes, that's pretty well represented within his caucus in particular. Remember, this is a caucus that was the unification of the old PC party and the Wild Rose party. So he's been kind of caught between, as Chantal says, the many Albertans who would like to have seen tighter restrictions and a significant section, particularly within his party, that think he's done too much. Indeed, he had something of a mini caucus revolt on his hands from people who thought he'd done too much. Mm-hmm. And in navigating between those two shores, I think he sort of managed to wind up infuriating both sides, and that would account for part of why he's at now in the polls.
It's interesting, Althea, that he said to his caucus members, "I'm okay if you want to have this debate, but I'm not okay if you encourage Albertans to not follow the rules." Even that itself, I think, is problematic for people, and then asking them to comply.
Well, I think the debate democracy angle was basically his response after he realized he can't really kick out a quarter of the members of his caucus. And many of those caucus members represent an even larger percentage of the people who form part of the United Conservatives base. So what impact did he have? Plus, I actually genuinely believe that Jason Kenney believes in strong independent MPs. He keeps talking about the UK example and how MPs there can speak their mind. He's been saying that even when he was in Ottawa as a cabinet minister. I think the problem for Mr. Kenney, as I think Andrew rightly points out, is that you can't have it both ways, and he's pleasing nobody at the moment. He downplayed the risk of COVID early on. Alberta was far more open. Frankly, it's far more open still now than where I'm sitting in Ontario. And so to go back to people and say, actually, you need to believe me, now is the time where we really need to comply, is hard for people to switch gears. So the people who wanted more action, as Chantal talked about, are unhappy, will remain unhappy. The people who don't believe this is a threat, and Kenney talked about this. In fact, in his press conference, he mentioned how the party itself is polling and knows there are lots of Albertans who do not believe the COVID forms a risk. So if they're polling about that, they're clearly polling about where they themselves are in the polls, and they have seen what we have all seen publicly, which is that Jason Kenney is now the least popular of all the premiers. 75% of people disagree with his handling of this issue. And the fact that he is acting now, well, he had no choice. I mean, with an 11% positivity rate, that's insane. So no wonder experts are telling him to be careful and to do things.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I should say I agree with him in part that we should be able to debate what is the proper policy, whether we should have a tighter lockdown or a looser lockdown. I have my opinion, you have yours, but we should be able to debate those things. But you should not be able to countenance people to break the law, particularly if you're an elected politician, to countenance people to break the law and or defy the law. And there should be some boundaries in terms of listening to the basic science on this and not pretending that this is all just a hoax or something like that. But we've got to be careful that we don't just completely rule out any constructive debate. Remember, early on in this debate, informed people were saying you shouldn't wear masks or we don't need to close down the borders. So we need to make some room for differences of opinion on this.
I wonder, though, how constructive the debate is, though, I guess would be my pushback to Andrew's point. Chantal, go ahead.
I think at this point we're way past this. And the pandemic is not the usual political debate story where you have your views, somebody else has a view, and at the end of the day, it makes everything better because the clash of ideas, and I do believe that, improves policy. But in this case, one of the most precious things that all political leaders in this country, and that includes Justin Trudeau, need to preserve is moral authority. And when the polls start telling you back in the fall that you are losing 2/3 of your voters, and you wake up at the end of April, beginning of May, saying, gee, you guys need to do this, and you're left with 75% who no longer believe in you, that is really difficult. Regardless of wanting to have a healthy debate, you have let this deteriorate to the point where you have zero credibility.
Yeah.
Well, but I agree with that.
But
I agree with that, but I think the problem is that Kenney himself has been inconsistent in his own messaging, not because backbench MPs haul off and say what they think. I don't think leadership requires shutting down every MLA. I think it requires the leader to show leadership himself.
Okay, good point, Althea, on that.
I will end on a more positive note. I think it's actually what we saw this week is the Premier taking action, imposing rules that I think are necessary, or at least the experts suggest are necessary. But what I thought was really useful is, in going to the people themselves, he took questions from people for an hour and 20 minutes. And then the next day he took questions from reporters for an hour and 20 minutes and explaining how he got there. And, it may not make a lot of sense to us in terms of, him saying, well, the reason we didn't enact rules earlier, tougher rules, was because we didn't think people were going to follow them. And you can't enact rules if you don't think people are going to follow them. Well, I think that's kind of partly your fault. But the fact that he's willing to put himself out there and to respond to constituents who are angry, I think is commendable. And I think we should note that.
But probably his only last choice, frankly, as well, that he had to do something because this wasn't working.
Well, he needs to convince them to follow after he told them that he himself didn't think they were necessary elsewhere.
Hey, welcome back. The Ontario government's been calling for tighter restrictions at the border, criticizing Ottawa's handling of the issue. It even purchased ads on Facebook to get its message out. Here's a little bit of one of those released today.
The more countries that have outbreaks, the less relevant borders become.
Trudeau didn't close the borders when the pandemic started. He didn't close the borders when it got worse. Nobody wants a fourth wave. It's time to act. A message from the Ontario PC Party.
So I'd point out a key point there that's from the Conservative Party and not the government. But is this the right strategy for the Premier for Ontario? Chantal, Andrew, and Althea all back for another round of At Issue. Okay, what is this actually about here? Because apparently when they had their call last week, the Prime Minister said, great, who do you want us to shut out of the country? And Doug Ford didn't really have a response. So what is this actually about here, Chantal?
It is slightly tone deaf. It doesn't answer the question of the only people coming in to the borders at this point, except for essential services, deliveries, etc., are Canadian citizens or Canadian residents. So what is the proposal here? To tell them what to stay where, question mark. It also is passing strange in the sense that the governments that are the most inclined to finger point at this point are those who are the most in trouble with their own public opinion as to how they have handled the pandemic. You're not hearing these commercials in French in Quebec. No one is there. You're not hearing them in BC. And frankly, I think it has more to do with the fact that a year from now to this week, today, we will be in the Ontario re-election campaign.
Mm-hmm. If we're not already. You're also not hearing those kinds of ads in Manitoba. Like, there's other places where there are Conservative premiers where that is not the position that they've taken. Andrew, what do you make of the sorry, Chantal, you wanted to make a point?
But they are not in trouble.
Yes, indeed.
Or not in increasing trouble from their own voters.
Sure. Andrew, what do you make of the strategy of trying to turn things back onto Ottawa?
Well, there's no doubt it's a desperation move. The Premier's in a lot of trouble politically, and to some extent deservedly so. It has some validity and truth in it, however. I mean, both levels of government in various ways have screwed up their respective responsibilities for this file. And it is true that the federal government was late to start to get control of the borders, and to this day has very uncertain and inadequate controls over it. People are coming in and are not being monitored in terms of whether they're observing the quarantine, for example, and that's a legitimate issue to raise. The way that they're raising it and the timing and the severity and the sort of amped up, dangerous sounding music, et cetera, is clearly designed to shift blame from the province. So even though both sides share some of the blame, I saw the point made today that, the Atlantic provinces are under the same federal government. So to the extent that the federal government has made things worse, it's made things worse for them as well. And yet they're performing so much better than Ontario. So to the extent that Ontario is doing worse, the province has to own its share of the blame for that.
Yeah, I would also assume that if you think that something more should be done at the borders, that you would then propose what that should be. And I'm not sure we've heard that clearly from the Premier. Althea.
Well, Ottawa says that what Doug Ford wanted in that call last week was to, when the option was given to him, was to, stop international students from coming in. But they seem to have backed away from that suggestion. There are things that they could do at the border. I take all of Andrew's points in terms of border control and quarantine and people taking fines rather than spending time in the hotels and perhaps not isolating as they say they are when they're home. For example, I was surprised to discover that people with non-Canadians who have immediate family member in Canada but plan to stay here for more than 3 weeks can stay and can fly in, and they just need to have a quarantine plan. So, there are still loopholes, if you want to call them that are happening. But none of that takes away from the fact that this is a transparent attempt to deflect. We saw Corey tonight. Has now been hired as a full-time campaign manager for the Ontario PCs. And I would say that they must be happy that actually the provincial parties can't count towards third-party advertising when it comes to federal elections, because if we had a federal election campaign very quickly, this possibly could be a third-party election ad, because it also helps, I think, Aaron O'Toole kind of chip away at the Prime Minister's credibility here on that file.
Andrew, then quickly Chantal. Andrew, then quickly Chantal.
I just note that the Liberals are fundraising now off of the Tory campaign, so everyone's exploiting everybody.
Yes. Chantal, last point to you.
And I'll just note that a lot of airplanes land in Montreal too, and at this point, Quebec is doing better than almost every province except for PEI, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick.
Okay, on that note,
Go figure.
Go figure, indeed. Okay, thank you all. Appreciate it. I'll see you back here next week.